Kia ora katoa. Good morning and welcome. This is the 19th day of the hearings of the submissions on Plan Change 7. And we start this morning with the submission of As One Incorporated.
Tēnā koe e te kaiwhakakawa, tēnā korua e ngā komihanga. Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Aotearoa mō As One Incorporated. Good morning, Your Honour. Good morning, Commissioners, and good morning, everyone else. And thank you for taking the time to attend this morning, and also Commissioners and Your Honour for your consideration of our submission. Perhaps, Your Honour, if I may commence with simply some corrections. One correction in particular to my written submissions, and that is at footnote 17. There is an error there in the...
Just a moment, please. Just a moment, and I'll bring it up so that I can give it proper attention. Page 17, is it?
It is footnote 17, and as it happens, it is on page 17 as well.
Well, thank you. Just a moment while I bring it up. Yes, thank you.
So, Your Honour, I had erroneously cited that particular King Salmon decision as the one ending number 40, and that number 40 should be 38, because as Your Honour will know, there were two decisions, and
yes,
both of them are helpful, but the particular points I was referring on came from that first decision. So my apologies if there was any confusion arising from that. Now, also I would like to thank the panel for the swift consideration of my memorandum and the additional matters that arose from Dr. Metherall's presentation. Now, just in that regard, Mr. Hawkins has updated his PowerPoint, and I just wish to include those extra points, and I just wish to check with the panel whether the panel is comfortable for him to work off that updated version, which was provided not on Monday but last night. Sorry,
well,
this morning.
About that, but we would like, if it can be provided to the staff as a new PowerPoint file, which we could use to substitute for the PowerPoint file that we already have.
Thank you, Your Honour. That occurred by email this morning.
Splendid. All right. Well, it might take a day or two before it reaches all of us, but
thank you.
That can't be helped.
Thank you, Your Honour.
So I'm wondering whether we should just go through all of the documents that we think we have and check them with you in case there's something that we haven't noticed.
Thank you, yes, Your Honour, that would be helpful.
So we start with the original submission.
Yes.
And the further submission.
Well,
we have the evidence of Dr. Freeman and a summary.
That's correct, sir.
We have the evidence of Julie Mertens and of Mark Nalder and of Alan Hawkins. And with Alan Hawkins, there is the presentation we've just been speaking of.
Yes.
There's evidence of Gavin Reid, and we have your legal submissions.
That's correct, Your Honour.
So, and then there's the memorandum about the matters arising from Dr. Metherall's evidence.
Yes, sir.
And I think that's all I have at the moment. Am I missing anything?
I'm not aware that you are, Your Honour. I'm checking with Ms. Robinson, but I can confirm that Your Honour has everything.
can we say how grateful we are that As One Incorporated is presenting a full and carefully presented case? Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honour. So I'm aware that the panel will have read my submissions in detail, so I'm not going to read them out. If I may, I wish simply to highlight a few points and give a very brief summary. And if I might be able to commence with a bit of a comparison or a metaphor, which in my submission gives a clear, high-level picture of As One's submission and position. And that's really, it is as if we are all together in a boat or a waka, and we are trying to all achieve or reach a particular destination. And in order to do that, we have supplies on board, but we're also aware that the water level in the boat cannot increase. There is a bit of water in the bottom of the boat, and it's concerning us all. And the question then is what to do about it. Something needs to be done about it, but the question is, do we now already throw overboard all the provisions to lighten the load so that perhaps we take on less water, or we delay the sinking, or is there some other way? And more importantly, do we know that the boat is actually taking on water? Is it still taking on water? And are there ways to stop it from taking on water other than the fairly drastic measure of throwing overboard our supplies? And perhaps there is always a danger in stretching an analogy, but we've just discovered that possibly the water level in the bottom of the boat that we can tolerate is a bit lower than we thought it might be. But that still doesn't alter the fact that we need to be quite sure that we are taking on water and the rate at which we're taking on water. And the other important point is certain things have already been done since this has been noted. And before we take the drastic steps, perhaps it's important to investigate properly whether those particular steps are working or not. And so in relation to that, Your Honour, that last point, obviously I hope it's clear to the panel that that's relating to one of the key points in As One submissions, which is really the fact that all the assessments that have been done are not being done on the basis of the fact that good management practice is legally now in force, and the fact that we now have the national environmental standards, which will, again, with the effect of a regulation, so doing the same thing as a regional rule would do, also drastically reduce nutrient or N loadings. And those are key measures which, when the appropriate statutory tests are applied, or let me rephrase it, that in my submission, the panel is obliged to take into account when applying the statutory tests correctly. And just in relation to that, Your Honour will notice that I have made quite a bit of emphasis on those statutory tests. And the key point really is my concern that the statutory tests seem to have taken a back seat to the zone committee process and their recommendations. And the key point here is, if we can go back to the analogy, the statute has prescribed the way in which we look at where's the water coming from, is it rising, and what's the best thing to do about it. And those are fairly clear statutory tests on the evidence. And with respect to the Section 42 officers, I'm not sure they have been particularly rigorous in applying that. And again, the key issues that come into that are the size of the disbenefits of their approach, the costs, the economic costs, and then also the assessment of what is the environment that this plane change is coming into. And that is an environment that is very strongly affected, must be, by the implementation of good management practice and the national environmental standards. And then the other point I wish to make is that as one is clearly not a let us carry on as we always have been, because our economic well-being goes above water quality. That's clearly not the case. In fact, as one recognises that fresh water quality is such an important part of people and communities' well-being, that is why it's been given the recognition it is. And it affects them directly as well, and they have no desire to see compromised, unsuitable freshwater quality at all. And they're willing to incur considerable expense for that. The monitoring, the intensified monitoring their relief seeks it comes at quite a cost to the individual consent holders. And there has been, as Your Honour, as the panel would have noticed from my opening submissions, somewhat of a shift in that as one is prepared to accept the reductions, well, certainly the first reduction of 15% by 2030, if a monitoring program put in place, the results of the monitoring in accordance with the relief they seek shows that that is necessary, and that in this situation the effective good management practice and the NES have not been sufficient to get the WACA, as it were, heading in the right direction with the right, with a suitable level of confidence that we're not leaking unduly. That's really a very high-level summary of the key position, Your Honour. And then there is one additional matter that I would like to address, which arose from a particular exchange that Your Honour had with Mr. Williams for Waimakariri irrigation, and it concerns the drinking water standards. The panel will note that I have made some submissions on that in the place of the Health Act. But just in terms of the evidence of, in particular, Dr. Humphrey, there is one particular phrase that he used, which I would tend to fall over, which is that if the MAV is exceeded, I don't know, those were his literal words, but babies will die. Those were his literal words. Now, I don't pretend to have his expertise, but my understanding of MAVs is that that is not how they work. Dr. Freeman doesn't have medical expertise. He's not a medical doctor, but he does have an understanding of generally how MAVs are fixed, and will be in a position to assist the panel with that. I just wish to make a few observations about Dr. Humphrey's evidence as well. It concerns me that he gave his evidence not in his statutory capacity as the medical officer of health, but for another submitter in quite a different role. And importantly, the Canterbury District Health Board was allocated time, and I understand they did not use that time. I've checked that the District Health Board has not filed evidence, and if statutorily nitrates and nitrates or nitrites, nitrogen derivatives in drinking water were such a significant public health issue, then I would expect via the statutory scheme that's in place that the District Health Board would have presented evidence, and that Dr. Humphrey would have been there in his statutory capacity. And I noticed from when he was giving his evidence that he was at pains to state that that was not the capacity in which he was giving that evidence. And it raises questions with me. I would want to know why that's not the case. And again, it's a difficulty I have with this process where there is no opportunity to cross-examine witnesses, because I imagine that both I and Mr. Williams at least would have had some questions for Dr. Humphrey in this regard. And so, Your Honour, I'm also grateful to the evidence given by Dr. Black, and in my submission, that if the panel is considering which evidence to prefer, it is very clear about the way in which the evidence was given, the good notice that was given by Waimakariri Irrigation, and the considered way that Dr. Black gave his evidence, that his evidence is to be preferred, and that's both his written and his oral evidence, Your Honour. And so in that regard, in my submission, it would be wrong at law to place any weight on the fact that Dr. Humphrey is, or was at the time that he gave his submission, his evidence, the medical officer of health. And then just finally moving through to what it is.
Sorry, I'm going to interrupt you there, Mr. Van der Waal, because I've got a further question that arises right on this topic. So while we have the topic in front of us, will you forgive me if I interrupt you?
Not at all, Your Honour. I was expecting that Your Honour would have questions for me, and I thought this was a new matter.
Well, I do have questions for you, but this one arises just from what you've been saying, and so I'm going to take it with you now. We have the evidence, as you say, of Dr. Humphreys, who wasn't before us in his capacity as MOH. Well, we know that. We have the evidence of Dr. Black, and you are inviting us to place more reliance on that. We also had the evidence called by the Christchurch City Council of Dr. Tim Chambers. And I'm wondering whether you have anything that you can add that you think might assist us in respect of the evidence of Dr. Chambers.
Your Honour, I note that Dr. Black's evidence was filed in rebuttal of that evidence, and I'm going to rely entirely on his rebuttal of that evidence, and I consider that he's adequately done that. And again,
I'll take it back further. You don't need. You've said what you have to say, but please carry on with the other elements. And I do have 2 or 3 questions that arose in my mind on studying your legal submissions, for which, of course, I thank you.
Thank you, Your Honour. I was at the point of nearly winding up really my high-level summary of AS1's case, and that is really that the key feature here, again, as I said at the outset, AS1 is not saying do nothing, don't make a decision. It's just saying be cautious in the way that you impose costs with respect. And the interesting feature of this is if the monitoring shows sufficiently or confirms what the modelling is suggesting, then the 15% reduction will be in place by 2030. It's only what occurs, the question is what occurs if, as Dr. Freeman has suggested, that modelling is suggesting matters which may not occur at all. And that is what, that's the key feature. The increased modelling, the increased monitoring and better consideration and more robust modelling is what, AS1 submission is really required to make sure that you're not, to go back to the parallel or the metaphor I've used, unnecessarily tossing overboard supplies that you may well need to survive. When you may already have done enough, or there may be other ways of achieving the same result. And that's the key point that's really being made here. And as you will hear from Dr. Freeman, the concerns about the modelling are in two respects, in that they may well be overestimating or indicating that increases are going to happen that may not happen. Or, and in addition to that, they may well be overestimating the effectiveness of what the 42A officers' approach might achieve. And I think that's an appropriate point at which to wind up my brief summary and hand over to yourself and the commissioners for any questions.
Yes, well, thank you, Mr. Van der Waal, for your summary. I will invite my colleagues to ask questions, and then I will ask some questions that have come to my mind in studying your submissions. Commissioner Van Voorthuizen?
Yes, good morning. There's just one issue I'd like to ask you about, and it arises from your paragraph 15. Which, as I understand it now, summarises the position of AS1. And I noted in your verbal that you said that the proposed monitoring comes at a cost to farmers. So based on that, but I'd like to clarify with you, I've assumed that the monitoring you refer to is the monitoring outlined in the original submission at page 4 of the table of relief sought.
That's correct.
Oh, okay. Have you got that table there? I just want to ask you some questions about that particular relief.
You retained the same pagination. So it's page 4.
It's page 4 of the table, but it's the suggested new policy 8.4. capital XX. Oh, there's 2 of those, but it's the one at the bottom of page 4.
Page 2, 3.
And so it's a new policy that says increased knowledge and understanding.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
So that suggested policy, which the amended relief would now rely on, applies to consent holders taking a groundwater sample in the month of August. So I just got some questions about that. How would that be implemented? Would that require a review of existing consents to amend their conditions to impose that as a requirement?
Well, I'm not sure that that could occur because I don't see that the plan was publicly notified with the requisite clause. I think in terms of 68(7), I'm not quite sure the exact provision, but I am aware that if existing consents, there is a power to review existing consents, but that if that power is being relied on, that needs to be signalled in the plan change when it was publicly notified. And I don't recall having seen that.
Okay.
So I understand that there may be limitations there, yes. It would, as a default, apply to any new consents.
Right, so it would obviously could click in upon expiry and replacement. So just moving on from that issue, and it stresses the monitoring would be undertaken by the consent holders, namely the farmers themselves. You may not be able to answer this, and if you can't, that's fine. A large number of the farmers, we've been told, within the Waimakariri NDA or in nitrogen priority areas are members of Waimakariri Irrigation Limited, they're shareholders, and I can't recall if they have their own consents or are they just subsumed within the WIL consent. Do you know that?
As far as I understand, they rely on the WIL consent, those who are members of WIL. Yeah. And just in relation to that, there is that's a matter that cuts both ways because WIL had also proposed additional monitoring. So certainly most or a large proportion of the AS1 members would be picked up, and that's the alternative way of not requiring the review. Yes. And still getting the data.
Yeah. So obviously, yeah, WIL have proposed some monitoring to us. I can't remember how many bores they were suggesting. It might have been 8 or 9 from memory, but just returning to the relief here. So if the monitoring was done by the individual farmers, I just got some concerns about sort of quality control. Might they have to drill new bores? How would that be undertaken consistently? They would then have to sample those bores. Would that be done by themselves or independently? And there's issues of consistency. How would those results be reported and where would the results be analysed? You can see I'm concerned there might be some implementation issues that would undermine the certainty of the results.
Yes, so I understand those are valid questions, and I will be frank in that I haven't gone to that level of detail, yeah. But I understand that Dr. Freeman does have the expertise to address those kind of matters in more detail.
Yeah. Okay. No, that was all I wanted to ask about that particular item of relief, but no further questions. Thank you.
Commissioner Solomon?
No, I have no questions, thank you.
Well, Mr. Bendeval, there were 2 or 3 things that came to my mind, and to be fair, your legal submission deserved more time than I had, yeah. And so although I read it, I will need to read it again. But in my first reading, there were a few things that came to my mind that I noted, which I'm going to take advantage of to discuss with you now, if I may. Section 80, capital A.
Yes, so that is dealt with at
now.
You're on. I deal with that in my submissions. I'm just trying to find the.
You do. Yes, I know that you do. And what I'm interested in is you and I both understand that Section 80A has gone through a major change.
Correct.
And the replacement is not yet in effect, but in any event is on a different topic, really. But it seemed to me there was something in the as one original submission that relates to this, and I'm not quite sure what happens now in relation to that part of the submission.
Yeah.
Page 9 of your submission, I think. And I'm not sure, I didn't carefully note it, whether it's page 9 in the table or in the text.
Your Honour, there is at paragraph 4 on page 5 of the written submission, as paginated in my version, which deals with section, which mentions section 80 capital A.
That'll be the one then. So is there some consequential amendment needed to that part of the original submission?
No, Your Honour, and that is because the way that the transitional provisions to which I referred, Your Honour, or the panel in my legal submissions indicate that in respect of the process now set out in section 80 capital A, this hearing is to occur as if the Act had not been amended. And the point I'm making really is it's simply connected to what is the correct statutory test. And I was acknowledging, well, the root of that submission was at the time I was aware that there was this process in the old version of section 80 capital A that allowed for the views of I can't remember the exact wording, but a collaborative planning group,
yes,
to be given greater weight than section 32. Now, Mr. Moore has accepted that that particular process was not chosen, and my submission is very much that in that situation, the only way in which the kind of emphasis that I'm finding in the Section 42A report, which is giving that level of priority to the zone committee's views, would be legitimate, is if that particular process had been followed and the zone committee had been appointed duly under that process. And so I think it's a fairly simple situation now. We know that that did not occur. And as a result, the only statutory way in which that departure could occur is inapplicable. So we're back to the normal, as if I may use that term, statutory tests under Section 32 and the first schedule. And that's the key point I'm making.
Very good, thank you. In paragraph 46.1 of your submission, you make reference to the national standards in place and so forth. And in trying to read all of the papers that I needed to read for this hearing, I didn't give enough time to rereading that particular paragraph of your submission to be sure that I understood it exactly. I noted instead that I would ask you to develop it so that I could understand it, to be sure I'm not misunderstanding the point.
Well, thank you, Your Honour, and I must apologise for my tendency, which I try to suppress, and which is to make long sentences with multiple conditional subclauses, and I fear that Your Honour has become the victim of that tendency. So really, the key point is that I'm trying to bring across here is, even though we know the NPS, the new NPS, sets lower standards, or lower standards, more stringent standards potentially, or has what I don't want to get into trouble with Dr. Freeman in terms of what they are, and he's better equipped to talk to the goals, so shall I say the objectives that it sets are more stringent. But again, the key point is a risk assessment is required under the statutory tests. And that risk assessment as to, even for those newer objectives, is to be undertaken taking into account how the future environment will be changed by the NES and good practice, good management practice. And that's really the point I'm trying to get across in those paragraphs, and my submission as well is that it's part of a package, the NPS Freshwater Management 2020, which envisages, it elevates freshwater quality to a level where it has a specific planning process which should apply. And that is the particular process now imposed through the new section 80 capital A. And I accept that I've just said this plan change is to occur procedure, and I think that one has to read that word and procedurally as if the Act had not been amended in this way. But I don't think the panel can ignore the fact that there is now a special procedure that will have to be or let it put it this way, the policy implications of Section 80A, as it now reads, that freshwater management is of such importance that the specific procedure has been provided for, and that councils have until 2024 to achieve those, to publicly notified documents which achieve those. And in the interim, the panel can have the security that, unlike normal situations where there would be no rules in place, we have the NES 2020 providing what it is hoped the rules will eventually provide as interim cover, which gives the panel a little bit more breathing space. And in terms of that, it does, in my view, alter how the panel looks at its duties to comply with or give effect to the NPS 2020, which, if I may add, itself, and I have mentioned the clause here, and I note that Mr. Moore acknowledged this in his submissions as well. It has recognised that there are limits by saying it must be given effect to the extent reasonably practicable. And that is an important point in my submission. It's not simply, I think that if scope was the only matter which altered things for the panel, then these words would be otiose, reasonably practicable. They go further than simply not legally capable of. It is, in my submission, they go to a recognition that these measures came in part way through, fairly late in this process, and these standards. So it does alter what practically and reasonably can be expected of this panel in giving effect to those standards.
Well, just forgive me if I ask another question that relates to that. I understand what you're saying about reasonably practical, but I also notice that it talks about having work, should I just use that general term, which is ambitious and reasonable. And I wondered whether you were going to help us to understand what that means.
I will confess I haven't turned my mind specifically to what ambitious means in this setting, but an off-the-cuff submission.
3.3.
Beg your pardon, sir?
It's paragraph 3.3 of the NPS 20.
I don't have a hard copy
No.
of it in front of
Well,
me.
in any event, it's unfair of me to expect you to give a response on the spot if you haven't had a chance to think about it.
Well, Your Honour, I am going to hazard an off-the-cuff response, which is ambitious is I think consistent with trying to achieve or setting a fairly high goal, as it were. But that's consistent with the objectives that have been set elsewhere. And so in my submission, it doesn't require this panel to go beyond the natural constraints and the practical and reasonable constraints that are imposed by the fact that this came along so late in the process. And I have elsewhere in my submissions set out the real, I think it's really near the beginning, the fact that I would have to check exactly whether those paragraphs are that I've listed, but I've listed all the things that had not occurred when this NPS was publicly notified, and they are simply associated with the fact that we're so late in the process, and that is where issues of fairness arise, and it is delegated legislation that cannot amend the statute. Thank you, Your Honour. It was at paragraph 40, and I've set out those matters in subparagraphs 40.1 to 40.4, and those are all of the matters that had not yet occurred, which, in my submission, truly constrain practically what this panel could be reasonably expected to do. And the requirements of fairness, which are written into the statutory process for this hearing, as Your Honour has previously alluded to. So that is a key issue. And if I may, I'm breaking my own rule in terms of instructing or helping witnesses. Prepare is never answer more than the question asked, but if in terms of or perhaps I will adhere to that rule and just wait. I think another question will come up on that issue, and perhaps I'll pause here if Your Honour has any clarifications for what I've said.
No, I'm content with that. There's only one other matter that I'd like to come to arising from your submission. And I'm just trying to have in my mind a brief conclusion to what you have to say about zone committee.
Yes.
And I've read what you have to say about zone committee, and I understand and I follow the train of thought that it expresses. So what is the end result that you urge upon us about the zone committee?
It's the point I made previously, Your Honour. It's simply that they were a perfectly legitimate and helpful tool in the pre-notification consultation. But apart from that, they have no statutory status beyond being simply a committee of the regional council that was used in terms of the pre-notification consultation. And so their views and recommendations cannot statutorily be given greater weight or be seen as evidence of the fact that certain requirements of the Section 32 analysis have been met. They can't supplant evidence. They don't supplant the need for evidence and reliable evidence as to what is the real risk, what is the size of the risk, how certain can we be of the risk, is it genuinely irreversible, and what are the various alternatives to dealing with this risk in view of that. They can't supplant that, and I acknowledge it places this panel in somewhat of a difficult position. But in relation to that, I do submit that's what Section 32 has envisaged, that at times there may be an option that is not the one that's been put forward because of particularly those issues.
Well, thank you for that. You mentioned that the panel's in a difficult position. We would have been at the start of the hearings. By the time we finished the hearings, and we've had all the help from AS1 Incorporated and many other submitters, will be in a much less difficult position.
That's understood, but Your Honour, with respect, I think the matters that both Dr. Meserel and Dr. Freeman still raise considerable issues and difficulties, and I still see that the evidence doesn't overcome those shortcomings, particularly in view of the matters I've set out in my paragraph 40, where this process, the fact that the NPS has come along fairly late in the piece, significantly constrains what various submitters might have liked to have put in their original submitters, or whether maybe a whole lot of other people would have submitted. And there are certainly fairness issues. And just on that point, it was the point I was going to make previously. It is a matter that I did raise in my written submissions. And that is the fact that I do think that it is inevitable that there must be some further process before 31 December 2024, if only due to scope limitations. I have no doubt that there will be things that the Regional Council would want to do in order to give effect properly to the NPS 2020, that it simply lacks the scope to do under the current plan change. And so this panel, although it can't sit back and say we'll leave it all to them, it can be reassured that you're in a very different position from other panels, where in that you have these interim controls in place in the NES, and you know that it is very likely there is going to be another process. And that alters, in my submission, also what you can achieve, which is making sure that sets this, that this process helps set up that next process so that it goes as smoothly as possible. And it's important that this particular process doesn't hamstring that process in any way. And one of the key issues that arises again is the need under Te Mana o Te Wai to consult with tangata whenua and communities in order to understand what Te Mana o Te Wai means to them and give that a real shape and form and plan provisions.
Thank you. I think that's sufficient at the moment. Thank you, Mr. Van der Waal. And we should perhaps come to evidence now.
Thank you, Your Honour, and members of your panel, of the panel for your attention for my submissions. I wish now to move to the as one witnesses, and we first have 3 witnesses of fact, and then those will be followed by 2 expert witnesses. And so the witnesses of fact are really the people on the ground who are affected by this, and they are lay people, as it were, but their evidence is very much based on their personal knowledge, and they have a real understanding on how this is going to work, of how this is going to affect real people on the ground. And with that preface, I would like to ask Mr. Mark Nolder to come up and assist the panel.
Now, we do have Mr. Nolder's evidence statement, and we have read it, so we don't expect him to read it to us.
I have indicated that to Mr. Nolder, and what he's going to do is simply give the panel some highlights. He will be referring to some notes he's made to help himself, but that's not a further set of submissions or evidence.
Thank you. Good morning, Mr. Nolder. Thank you very much for coming. We invite you to proceed on that way.
Yeah. Thank you for listening to me today, Commissioners. And I've got my submission. I'm going to read, not all of it out, but some of it. I know you've just said you've read it, but I want to read through it myself so you can hear it. And there's a couple of extra things in there that I might talk about. And so, yeah, we'll get started. I've put this submission in Pam and myself, and under the As One umbrella. But I'll start with my experience and background in our farm. My name is Mark Nolder. I'm a dairy farmer near Cuss Township. My wife Pam and I, we operate as Four Hooves Limited, and we have owned and operated this farm for 6 years, and we milk 360 cows. I worked in the building sector for 8 years before we started share milking 330 cows on my parents' property. We contract milked and share milked all over for the next 5 years, building up our numbers to 920 in Waimate. Having moved several times, that gave us equity to purchase our current farm in 2014. The wealth we built up, we achieved ourselves through a huge amount of hard work. We are incredibly proud of our farm that we now own and operate ourselves, not for someone else. Although we employ some casual staff, my wife and I run the farm mostly ourselves. The property has been dairy for around 80 years. A local historian thinks that it was the second farm in Canterbury to be irrigated. The Cuss River runs through our property. Our farm is irrigated with water from wells on the site. We are slightly unusual in the area as we do not supply water by Waimakariri irrigation. Our farm is located in Zone E of the nutrient priority areas identified by ECAN Plan Change 7. Within that zone, there is a requirement that our farm reduces nitrogen loss by 90% beyond GMP. To us, the impact of that you need to understand our current situation. The nitrogen base for the property is 59 kilograms of N per hectare. In 2018, 2019, our loss rate, as estimated by Overseer, was 54 kilograms of N per hectare. When we use the farm portal to assess our GMP baseline number, we are advised it is 36 kgs of N per hectare. This is a significant shift from our current situation. We made a submission in our own name, Four Hooves Limited, submitted number 272. However, we are also members of the As One group and fully support the submission and evidence that that group prepared. My wife and I fully support the goals of improving water quality, and we acknowledge the importance of farming well. However, the methods that this plan change proposes will only result in sending those farmers within the nutrient priority bankrupt. Any environmental improvements need to be introduced in a way that is financially viable. My key concerns with Plan Change 7 are proposed are the 6 recommendation steps as proposed in Table 8 and 9 for our property will send me and Pam broke. The dairy milking platform will be non-viable. Immediately, there is an effect on the value of our land property. Secondly, there is impact on profitability. That effect on cash flow is not immediate, but the effect on the value of the property is. That will affect our bank security. That means that any improvements need to be paid for out of cash flow. For example, an example of this is a pivot at 300,000 to 400,000 is difficult to pay out of cash flow. I just want to touch on something after there while I'm on that stage. Banks have got a huge point in this. I know farmers, we've been advised of this, but banks have got a big part as well. I'm a first-time farm buyer. I'm like first-time home buyer. My equity is low. My debt is high. Banking industry has changed a hell of a lot in the last 2 to 4 years, especially in the agricultural industry. Everything now, bankers say to councils, government, everyone, yes, we support our farmers environmentally. Yes, we do this. But when the banker comes down your drive to a farmer's driveway, he says, oh, you're doing a great job. Everything's good. But no, we're not going to lend you money. You need to pay for that out of cash flow. Cash flow, we can buy fence posts, do plantings, we can do moisture meter, we can do all the small ticket items, but you cannot go out and by big ticket items, and that's what these reductions are asking. Right, where the hell was I up to? So, hang on. Right. Back to 12. Right. The reduction steps are stated as being needed to improve water quality in the Cuss main drain, yet less than half of the Cuss catchment area has been included in Zone E. The remaining area of the Cuss surface water catchment requires no reductions beyond GMP. The reductions are primarily to be made by dairy farming platforms and the other consented activities. There are approximately 1,500 hectares of the dairy platform, milking platform, that is in both Zone E and in the Cuss surface catchment. That is 8.5% of the Cuss surface catchment of 17,856 hectares. That small area has been responsible for achieving a large portion of the water quality, of the required water quality improvement. I have read evidence that Mike Freeman has prepared for the As One group. Although I don't pretend to understand everything he says, it resonates that what I understand as a farmer in that area, there seems to be some massive flaws with what ECAN is imposing that Mike has identified. My biggest fear is that those proposals will send us and others like us in the NPA broke, all without improving water quality because so many sources are unchecked. Under Plan Change 5, is it meant to be 4?
That's fine.
Yeah, sorry. Under Plan Change 5, we are required to be farming at GMP from the 1st of July 2020. That is now. That means we should be farming to the GMP number of 36 kilograms of N per hectare. That reduction steps from, that would be to 30, 25, 19, 14, 9, and finally down to a number of 3 kilograms per N per hectare. Over 6 steps, 3. Which mean that that's not feasible. That we will go as hard and as long as we can with cows, which means then we will get off the dairy milking platform, out of dairy cows, and we will have to take on dairy grazing, which only goes 30% or something like, yeah. And the ironic thing is, for us to hit our good management practice this year, we sent our cows 2 kilometres down the road to winter in exactly the same area, under the purple zone, and they only have to go 30%. So that's what we will have to do. It is my understanding that the portal which generates the GMP number that does not work. Again, this isn't something I pretend to be an expert on. However, I am someone whose livelihoods is made or broken by that number. I understand around the farming community there are serious concerns with how the portal works and the number it generates. It doesn't seem fair to me that my business and my livelihood is dictated by something that is commonly accepted as flawed, at best, or broken beyond repair. That our farm is not part of a scheme, nor did we have an effluent consent granted in 2019 or to 13 baseline. So we are limited by our actual baseline. We suspect we are in the minority of reductions agreed to by others are likely to have a greater impact on us. I am representing this evidence because I am hugely concerned about my future and the future of my family. There is no question that these changes will bankrupt us. The only question is how quickly we will get there. These changes will not only affect us, they will affect the rural businesses we support, local schools, our children attended, and community events we assist with. We will all suffer as the farmers within the NPA struggle to continue farming. There's a couple of things I want to touch on, and that is, one, every number I've said, our farm has to do it by itself. We are not in an irrigation company. I don't know the full ins and outs of how all that works, but we can't chuck our numbers into it. We have to do every number by ourselves. We're standalone. We are unique in that zone. Now you're probably going to ask me, did you do your due diligence? Was it
Diligence.
Yep. Did you do that? And I'm going to say yes, we did, because when we bought the farm, the banks did their job. Our farm advisors did our job to make sure it was right and it was conservative. Our land agent, he did his job. We put a tender in, won the tender in December 2013. 2014, February 2014, so 2 months later, the zones all came out 2 months after we brought it. So they had the green zone, the orange zone. I got rung by my banker, what zone are you in? I says, bloody red zone. So that's why we are where we are. I love it where we are. It's a great farm. It's producing high quality milk with a really low N loss. I'm the first one that's going to get taken out of this, and I'm punching way above my weight when it comes to a low N loss, and that's what we're all talking about. I think that's, yeah, is there any questions, Commissioners?
Well, thank you, Mr. Alder. Commissioner Fanfield present.
Thank you very much for that. I mean, the points you've made are very well made, and we've heard similar but different points from other farmers who've come before us. I just want to ask you some more about moving from your quarantine loss down to your baseline GMP that's generated by the portal. And I understand your current's 54, you need to move to 36. And you mentioned, I think, but I didn't quite catch it, you wintered your cows off farm for 2 months, is that?
Yes, that helped. It didn't bring it all down, but things like that. We've changed our irrigation. We are sending cows to the works earlier to try and get to that number. There's a lot of processes that you can go through, and we're getting advised by our reps on how to do that, because they just put it all into these things and it spits it out. And so, but every number, every digit makes a difference going the right way. But 36 is pretty low, and then 96 from 90% from there. So it's a bit of, I don't want to get off the point, but you know, it's, you know, you work hard to hit those numbers, and when you know you've got to go 90% after that, how would you feel? It's just, it's a bit. Yeah.
So to get down to the GMP, you've done what I might summarise as some farm management changes.
Yes.
But to get to the first step of Table 8.9, a further 15%, that would require major capital expenditure, is that right?
Yes, that's correct. And that, at this stage, we have had, we've had some good years, but banks, they are taking everything for principal. That you can only pay for stuff. In our situation, you can only pay for stuff out of cash flow. And, yeah, I think there's a bit of an assumption out there that when people are talking to dairy farmers, they can afford it. That is not true. There's a small portion that can afford anything, but majority cannot. It takes time. We work towards those things. It's yeah.
Okay. Now, thanks for that. There are just a couple of things I wanted to clarify with you, but thanks very much.
That's all right.
Commissioner Solomon, any questions?
No, I have no questions, thank you.
Mr. Nalder,
Yes.
you've gone to a lot of trouble preparing to come in to give this statement today. I can see that, and you've anticipated the question that I was going to ask, and you knew I was going to ask it about due diligence. So the only question that remains in my mind is this. Are you going to come back to present your own personal submission, or is this to be taken as your visit to us today?
No, I'm not doing that. Once is enough.
Yeah, that's all.
No, but the reason we put that submission in was because I hadn't heard of as one. We got told about this plan, about what was happening, and we got told, and we read it and we thought that's hard, that's real harsh. So Pam and I, we didn't know what to write, so we wrote down, but what we read on that first submission of ours, under 4 hooves, was basically the same as what we've said here, and then I've jumped under the umbrella of as one because, you know, the farmers are just a bit strong. Yeah, more you got, so yeah, sorry about that one.
Well, I understand all of that, and thank you very much for coming in and giving us your take on it so straightforwardly. Thank you.
No, thank you for listening to me.
Your Honour, would you like to proceed to the next witness at this stage?
No, I think you're right, Mr. Van der Waal. It's a good moment for us to take a break, and we'll start again in a quarter of an hour.
Thank you.
Now, Mr. Van der Waal, who would you like to call next?
Your Honour, just perhaps before I commence with that, and I'll answer that question. Mrs. Mertens, if you could take a seat. Your Honour, Mrs. Mertens will be getting evidence next. But just to clarify, both she and Mr. Reid have put in their own submissions, and I know that Mr. Nelder clarified that matter, but they will not be returning. This is both on behalf of as one and their own submission. So if I may, thank you. And again, Mrs. Mertens will be referring to some notes she's made, but won't be rereading her submissions. And if I may hand over to her.
Well, good morning, Mrs. Mertens. Thank you very much for coming in. And we're impressed with the fact that you, as well as having prepared an evidence statement, you've got some notes to speak to now. And thank you for that. And when you're comfortable and ready, you can start.
Good morning, Commissioners. Thank you for taking the time to listen to me today. My name is Julie Mertens. I'm 56 years old and third generation custodian of the land. I own a dairy farm with my husband Andrew, which we've farmed for almost 30 years. Our farm has been rezoned under Plan Change 7 into the proposed purple zone of the Waimak district. This zoning will have the most ominous consequences on our farming business. I have personally farmed all my life, and the impacts of Plan Change 7 being considered now, and any decisions made by you will definitely be the biggest and most important decisions to be made in my farming career. I've never spoken at anything like this before, and I'm trying my utmost to deliver a submission that is not emotionally charged. But please bear in mind, I'm speaking to retain my home, my family's future, and my own personal identity. So there will be some passion and there will be some stress in my delivery. We can only work within our circle of influence, and that is why I'm here today. I basically have a few minutes to change my life. In these few minutes, I need to try and say something that will impact on you three people to stop the devastation to us and our farming community based on unproven modelling. The impact of your decisions will directly affect me, my family, our employees and our community, and collectively all of New Zealand. I believe most people are unaware of the extent Plan Change 7 will have on their lives. Many individual farmers have been unable to formulate a submission as the formulation process is so foreign to them. They are also tied by time constraints, financial constraints, and their lack of scientific knowledge. To have done an individual submission and to do it justice, I would have needed to take many weeks off farm to study Plan Change 7, to research modelling and environmental science, and to bear the cost of obtaining expert knowledge so I could fully understand the environmental impacts and economic impacts to our farm. Then I'd need to do our own modelling and cash flows to gain the full on-farm impact of each scenario. If Plan Change 7 is adopted with no revisions, then you are expecting me to be an expert in all of these fields and all of the environmental aspects that you will require me to implement. I am very lucky to be able to speak to you today under the AS1 umbrella. To date, it's cost AS1 over $200,000 to be here. This money has been willingly paid by many grassroots farmers, businesses and community individuals, and as well as many hours of voluntary time from many individuals committed to this submission. They have supported as one because they are extremely concerned of the effects that Plan Change 7 will have on our farming and rural communities. Farmers accept change every day, farming the weather, stock, water, people, markets, and their finances. Evaluating and solving problems is day-to-day work for us. Farming is always about change and adjusting to different conditions that are not always fair. However, what we face today is totally unreasonable, and Dr. Freeman's conclusions will clearly cover this. Worse still, in my opinion, there appears to be a calculated bias against farming in New Zealand. Farmers value their animals and they value their land. And they are committed to their farming future. This proposal would take that away. Future planning for the next 60 years with a plan that rezones the whole region into defined areas makes no practical sense. This rezoning has already reduced our farming equity. Dairy farms especially are unsaleable, banking covenants are being breached, and banks are reluctant to lend and are already withdrawing funding. Our ability as a family to continue farming our land is already in question. Proposed farm reductions will affect our profitability and destroy any motivation for improved sustainability. These changes are already occurring with less operating capital and less opportunity to sell. This is already happening now, and ECAN has only drawn a map. I don't believe corporate or overseas retirement funds will farm the land with the consideration and empathy that the generations of farming families have. While they might have high levels of compliance, do they have the stewardship? Most farmers have massive debt for the privilege of owning the land. Privilege is the word I use, as most individual farmers believe that to have private ownership of this amazing country is indeed a privilege and worth the burden of the debt. Currently, I manage with my husband a dairy platform and 2 runoff blocks. We're very hands-on with the day-to-day running of the farm and can easily work 16-hour days. This incorporates all the administration and business requirements for our animals, employees, our financial responsibilities and future planning. Our equity will be significantly reduced, which will then impact on our cash flow. This in turn will reduce our capacity to employ people and impact our spending over many associated businesses. Then we have the implication of good management practice with audits from Wills Irrigation, ECAN and Fonterra, which we accept. We do trials for carbon reductions and we create farm environmental plans with our consultants. We also deal with many other legislative requirements put to us by councils and MPI. All of these requirements are at our own cost. We also shoulder social opinion and media coverage of the farming community as a whole, which is not always accurate or easy to manage. Yet to come is the proposal Plan Change 7, which I believe is founded on unreliable, often inaccurate information, and modelling which is creating immense mental stress and pressure on myself, my husband, my family and my friends. Plan Change 7 was written by supposed experts in their field. However, the points outlined by Dr. Freeman would suggest you cannot build a legal requirement for farmers and expect to get a result that works with the wrong information. My understanding of Dr. Freeman's conclusions are that there's been no independent validation of the modelling. The sub-areas are not justifiable as half of the Cuss catchment area is not in it and only some heavy soils have been included. The rules are being made on information that is very significantly uncertain. The modelling is flawed and does not match the scientific data available, and the water quality is reported incorrectly. An assumption of nitrogen levels in coming years is incorrect. And dairy farmers are being blamed for nitrate levels that are in some cases the same as they were over 30 years ago. I question the suggested reduction levels from Wills irrigation in the next generation and whether they can be achieved while staying profitable and whether these levels can be validated on an individual basis. My view is that we investigate further the modelling used. Dr. Freeman's points need to be clarified and all available scientific data needs to be clarified before we can form any opinion or settle on any meaningful reductions. Those of us in the purple zone only have one place to go, and that is to this hearing. I ask you three people to cast our democratic right over a decision that has massive doubt over its credibility and could easily not achieve the results that we'd all like to see. The reason I support As One submission is they have not said no to reductions. They've taken the common sense approach that want to build a foundation that is based on fact and data. And they want these changes to happen over a realistic time frame. All of us want to meet water quality targets within a community that is already open to improvements. We have no wish to destroy our own environment. We are talking about our homes. Don't regulate us out of existence. Devastating your rural communities will impact on your wider economy. New Zealand is small in the world market, and we need all of us working together, not fractured. My conclusion, and I trust that you understand the points that I've made, and to summarise, the modelling used in Plan Change 7 has more than reasonable doubt over it, and the proposed reduction tables take away my future. Those colours on the map are real people, just like me. I'm one of nearly 90 voices from As One Incorporated, speaking up for the future of New Zealand's farming community. Let's go back to logic and common sense based on real data to achieve water quality. Our farming future is down to 3 people judging on our democratic right. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Mertens, for coming in and for preparing to tell us how you feel about it and what your experience is. Make questions from my colleagues, but you can be sure that we've listened closely to what you have to say. Commissioner Van Voorthuizen?
No questions, but I certainly understand the points that you're making. So.
Commissioner Solomon?
No, I have no questions either, thank you.
Well, Mrs. Mertens, I say again, we're grateful to you. It requires people to come along and tell us how they feel, if they feel strongly about it, as you obviously do, and to explain why, as you have done. And thank you very much for your part in this process.
Thank you, Your Honour. If we could now move on to Mr. Gavin Reid, whom I'd like to call.
Good morning, Mr. Reid.
Morning, sir.
Thanks for coming in.
Thank you.
You've already put in a written evidence statement, which we've read, and now's your opportunity to speak to it as you choose.
Thank you very much. Tēnā koutou katoa. Hi, I am Gavin Reid and I farm at Bennett's, Oxford, in the Waimakariri district. I apologise in advance for reading this from a script, but I felt there's too much information I needed to cover and too important for our farming future in the district for me to speak without notes. My history is I'm fifth generation on my current farm. Our family has farmed there since 1870. I worked on the farm since 1979 when I left school. I completed the bag at Lincoln University in 1982. I managed and progressively bought the farm since 1987. I'm married with 3 adult children. My wife works as a full-time teacher. I was on the board of Waimak Irrigation for 10 years and the chairman for 8 years. I received the New Zealander of the Year Local Hero Award in 2019 for service to the community. My farm is 227 hectares. I'm mixed arable and beef dairy grazing unit. Previously was sheep and arable, but the sheep farming was unsustainable due to poor returns and wide variations in lamb production, along with wool being totally uneconomic. 2/3 of the farm is irrigated starting in 1999. Beef numbers vary throughout the year from 300 to 500 animals, and approximately 150 dairy heifer calves and 150 dairy heifers are grazed annually. Arable area is approximately 80 hectares and fluctuates depending on net returns from various crops. Net returns from crops are reducing year on year, with long-term viability of cropping unknown, as our crop yields are below those produced in other regions due to our soil type. Pasture production has large variations, so I have set up the farm to maximise the use of feed when it is available, buying and selling cattle all year round. Winter crop is a necessary part of the farm operation, as we cannot carry enough stock through the winter on grass grazing alone. We prefer to only grow young stock to reduce soil degradation and end losses, which have reduced our income. Grazing older cows is far more economic to do, but the damage to our soils from grazing them and the higher end losses from larger urine patches has long-term consequences for our farm. The resultant soil damage from the heavier animals can take several years to recover from. We are continually evaluating new crops and grazing regimes which may have potential to improve our economic and environmental outcomes. We have spent over $150,000 improving irrigation uniformity and infiltration rates by changing 2 irrigators from large rotorainers to turbo rain type irrigators. This has improved our uniformity of application to approximately 85%. Irrigation is scheduled dependent on crop requirements. I currently use 9 soil moisture monitoring sites with either neutron probes or telemetered sensors, which give me daily results of what my soil moisture status is. I actively manage on a daily basis my irrigation rotation, taking into consideration crop requirements, soil moisture status, weather forecasts and irrigator return periods. My general irrigation return period is 10 days between waterings. Centre pivots are not appropriate for my farm due to the cost of the infrastructure and the farm layout with intersecting neighbouring properties and roads. We have changed our cultivation practices to minimise the use of deep ploughing. We now use shallow surface cultivation or direct drill into crop residues. This reduces the risk of end leaching through the soil profile before plants can uptake the nitrogen stored in the soil. With ploughing, dead plant matter is buried, and when it breaks down, nitrogen is released into the soil. Any new crop planted on the surface may not have developed sufficient root depth to uptake the stored N. This N can then leach through into the aquifers. By minimising cultivation, this situation is less likely to occur. For nitrogen fertiliser management, I use fertiliser reps and PGG rights and technical field reps to give me application rates and application timings. I also use satellite imagery to measure crop densities. This allows me to further refine nitrogen application rates to target specific areas within the crops and to adjust rates to suit. I monitor nitrogen usage by getting deep end testing done on all autumn cereal crops to ensure the correct application rates are used each spring. I spent $15,000 3 years ago upgrading my fertiliser spreader. This allows me to use variable rate spreading of fertiliser, weigh scales on the machine, auto-adjust spreading rates, which allows even more accurate spreading. We put GPS on one tractor that also makes spreading more accurate. This minimises any doubling up of spreading and reduces wastage. It also records tracking of the spreader and proof of placement as part of our farm environment plans. We use N-Protect urea to minimise nitrogen losses to the atmosphere after N applications. We have changed grass types on our dryland areas from ryegrass to deep-rooted grasses such as savvy cocksfoot, which are better at capturing N losses from stock. We have also added Ecotane plantain to our mix, as has been proven to reduce N losses from the soil profile. We put white clover with all our grasses to reduce the use of artificial nitrogen. We have changed our winter grazing kale crops to smaller leafier type kale. This is a higher quality kale, but the yields are lower and it requires us to put in a larger area to meet our feeding needs. The reason for this is it reduces the pugging, as the animals need a larger area each day to meet their needs, while improving the utilisation of the crop. The larger area used each day means that there is a lower concentration of urine and therefore reduced N losses to the soil. The downside is it has increased our costs if we put in a larger area of kale to meet our needs. And we have increased the area of saved grass for winter grazing to decrease the need for alternative winter crops to help offset this. Our farm cost and viability. We have spent a lot of money in comparison to our total income to improve the farm both environmentally and economically. Without irrigation, we would have had to sell the property a number of years ago, as the dryland sheep operation wasn't viable due to droughts and extreme weather events. Continual increases in operating and compliance costs are threatening the viability of my farm going forward. Our income from beef and cropping remains static, while costs keep climbing. This reduces our net income yearly. In 1981, my net income from a paddock of dryland barley was nearly $600 a hectare. Last year, my net income from irrigated barley was approximately $1,200 a hectare, and next year is projected to be under $1,000 a hectare. My farm working, insurance and administration costs currently sit at over $1,900 a hectare. This deficit of between $700 and $900 a hectare means that we must get more than one crop in the ground each year. So we follow up the arable crops with ryegrasses to increase the grazing area of the farm, and this helps give us our winter grazing area. Our beef schedule last year at its peak was $6 a kilogram. This year it peaked at $5.40 and currently sits at $5 with further reductions expected. These fluctuations in return mean we have to be very careful with our stock buying policy. If we pay too much for the weaner cattle, there's no margin left when we sell them 6 to 10 months later. I have reduced our N losses as much as practicable to meet GMP. If I am further required to reduce N losses more than 5% beyond GMP, I would have no other option but to reduce stock numbers and crop yields. This will impact our financial viability severely, and our farming future will be in serious doubt. So how does this relate to PC7? All the changes I've made to improve my farm practices have been occurring for over 10 years. The models used within PC7 don't account for these changes. overseer currently doesn't have the ability to adjust for the changes I have made in both cropping and in my beef operation, i.e. it doesn't differentiate between small seed crops, and small seed crops differ in the amount of nitrate released to the soil. It doesn't adjust for varying rates of irrigation application during stages of an arable crop's growth, nor adjust for the number of water applications during each month of a season. These changes are very difficult to model, but are a key part of my moisture management to reduce N losses. It doesn't adjust for, overseer, doesn't adjust for the pasture types that I use to reduce N losses from the soil during the year, i.e. Ecotane plantation and savvy cocksfoot. I have made changes to my farm practices which I believe go far beyond GMP, yet PC7 will force me to make further reductions. We will be unable to do this without reducing stock numbers or crop yields seriously affecting the viability of our farm. The fact that I've been proactive in reducing N losses by making changes early has left me with a lower overseer number than I would have had I not made any changes. I see this as potentially further penalising my operation, as I will still be required to reduce N losses even further. Making these changes early has already impacted us financially. I cannot grow arable crops or grow beef animals without the use of irrigation. The climate extremes cause too much variation in both crop yields and pasture growth rates to manage, while the input costs remain quite similar whether irrigated or as dryland. To return the area to dryland won't necessarily reduce N losses into the underground aquifers. The 1970s and 89 droughts all showed marked increases in N measurements in lower stream waterways. This was recorded in the long-term averages on well monitoring data in the area. This is due to nitrate build-up in soils over summer as grasses died off due to the extreme dry periods. When autumn rains came, the nitrates were leached below plant rooting depths before the grasses could recover and become re-established. Properly monitored irrigation keeps grasses from dying during hot summer periods and thus stops the build-up of N in the soil profile during these dry periods. It has been suggested that tree plantations be planted on 20 to 30% of your farm area as another alternative to current farm use. While this may be practical on a large hill country property with uncultivatable areas, it is not economically viable for the Canterbury Plains. I planted a 2-hectare block of trees on the dryland area of my farm in 1992 as a boost to our farms when we retired. In 2014, we had severe gale force winds throughout Canterbury. The block of trees was flattened and were too dangerous to cut up by hand for firewood. As the gales were region-wide, there was no market for the wood for manufacturing. We had to get a contractor in to clean up and burn the trees in heaps at a cost of $14,500. Shelter belts are a great asset to a farm, but there are huge risks with growing plantations of trees on the Canterbury Plains, not only financially, but from fire as well. And at 57, I am unwilling to wait 30 years for an income from trees. Unnecessary consequences. Requiring changes of more than 5% reduction beyond GMP for non-dairy farms will cause unnecessary hardship for myself and a number of other farmers in the district. It will make my farm uneconomic to continue and force me into considering whether to sell part or all of my farm. The thought of this is extremely upsetting for me and my family. It makes me feel as if I've wasted 40 years of hard work. Sorry. An effort to improve my property. The previous generations of my family on this farm spent their entire lives developing this property. Sorry. The most likely options to sell will be either to my neighbouring dairy farm as a run-off unit or as lifestyle properties with potentially 50 units being created. The viability of the farm being returned to a dryland sheep property would mean that the farm value would need to be less than half of what it currently valued at, leaving very little equity for my wife and I to leave with. The PC7 plan, as it stands, doesn't manage outputs from lifestyle properties. This means that ECAN will lose any ability to make changes to N levels in aquifers in the future, should this happen on a large scale. The analogy of herding chickens comes to mind. The current farm owners in the district are highly skilled, motivated and engaged to make changes to their operations where possible. If they become uneconomic to run, the ability of these owners and managers to make changes will be lost, as it requires capital to make these changes. The banks won't lend to unviable farms, regardless of what the funding is needed for. I have over 40 years of hands-on experience on how to manage my farm. I have been university educated and continually upskill myself with the latest research and technology that science has to offer. I have experienced the worst of weather extremes and continually sought better ways to improve the economic and environmental outcomes from my property. I have invested my entire career on improving and sustainably managing my property with an eye to leaving the property in a better, more productive position. I continually try to ensure that the environment, both above and underground, is properly managed. If I am forced to sell my property due to the imposition of unrealistic regulations, using modelled measurements only as the guide, I will be at a loss as to who will replace me and achieve a better outcome than I have. This attitude to improving the environment in our region was also at the forefront of my time as chairman of Waimak Irrigation. During the 8 years I chaired WIL, the WIL board moved from a company whose main priority was a reliable source of water to our shareholders to setting up an environmental team to help shareholders manage their environmental footprint. WIL set up FEPs and farm auditing along with irrigation metering and monitoring. This has shown huge improvements to the way that the shareholders run their irrigation systems. Continuous monitoring of soil moisture profiles along with measuring water usage are all tools used to minimise N leaching. All the shareholders have to comply with FEPs. Audits by WIL ensure that the improvements that shareholders have said will happen actually do occur. I also spent 8 years assisting NIWA scientists to develop soil moisture monitoring programs which, combined with weather forecasting, help farmers monitor soil profiles. This enabled farmers to schedule irrigation while reducing excessive drainage and N losses from their soil profile. Our whole community and district is built around the viability of the farm sector. If we fail, then so will they. Our whole social network is also built around the farming sector, with clubs and other functions within the community largely built on the voluntary support of the farming community. I am deeply concerned about the mental stress that this plan is causing all of us, including myself, my family and our friends. We feel we are continually under attack from the media, uninformed and misinformed people, along with government entities, for our farm practices and farm type. These attacks are often unjustified. I struggle to find the PC7 tabled reductions in 8.9, along with the different mapping zones, as fair and reasonable when you compare them with the measured results of the last 30 years. This, along with neighbouring farms being zoned either as the worst or least affected farms, will have severe consequences for the properties in the purple zone. These properties are already virtually unsaleable at present, and even after the PC7 plan is finalised, will have severely reduced values unless the current proposals are radically altered. In conclusion, I have made huge changes and improvements to my farming practices. This is not just because of economics and meeting GMP. I want the farm to the best of my ability. I want the farm to produce the least N and P losses that it can do. I want the farm to be as environmentally sustainable as possible. I want it to be available for future generations of farmers to continue to produce food for our community and for New Zealand. I am not in the purple zone, but believe that we all contribute to the status of the underground aquifers and lowland streams. We should all do our best to reduce N levels in these waterways. PC7 Table 8.9 needs to be removed as it won't produce the outcomes that it seeks to achieve. It targets small areas to meet the required results while excluding a large number of contributing farms in the catchment. It will decimate a small number of farmers. Small reductions, if necessary, across a larger catchment will achieve a much better outcome with far fewer unnecessary consequences. The modelling in the PC7 plan doesn't take into account current farm practices and the improvements that have already been made to meet GMP. The plan talks of N loads to come while taking no account of changes that are already occurring. Returning the area to dryland farming won't achieve the outcome sought. Monitoring and measuring the underground aquifers and streams within the catchment is the only way that we can truly tell if what we are doing on farm is working. Trends will tell us what effect we are having. The huge progress that has already been made by the farming sector has been seriously undervalued by the ECAN PC7 report. It has not shown any adjustments have been made to allow for the progress made to meet GMP. Riparian planting, fencing, setbacks from rivers and stream edges have already slowed sediment, fertiliser and nutrient runoff into these rivers and streams. The farmers quite clearly understand the need to improve the quality of these waterways. I believe that measurement of N levels over the next 7 to 10 years will show this to be true. Setting a date of 2027 to monitor current trends will allow farmers to fully implement GMP on their properties and allow for trends to show up within the catchment. This will allow everyone to prepare for future reductions, if required, and to readily implement these changes in a quick and managed way. A further date for reassessment in mid-2035 would then allow enough time for future trends to be assessed. This will allow farmers to plan with confidence for the next 10 years, while signalling to the banks any required capital to meet these objectives. Going beyond 2030 with continued stepped reductions is currently unjustified. They will also be unachievable for a large number of farmers and will place huge stress on them unnecessarily. I look at other groups who are volunteering reductions beyond 2030 and struggle to see how they will achieve them. They have given little indication on how they intend to meet those reductions while remaining a viable farming entity. I know that I won't be able to meet them. Thank you for listening to my story, and I hope that my information will assist you in making your decision. Ngā mihi, kia koutou katoa.
Well, thank you, Mr. Reid. Any questions of Mr. Reid, Commissioner Van Voorthuizen?
No, Mr. Reid, no questions for you again. The points you've made have been very clearly made, but there is one issue that you raised and other submitters have raised, which I'd invite Dr. Freeman to comment on if he's willing to when we hear from him. And the issue is that we've had a number of submitters say that Table 8.9 penalises them because they've already made significant on-farm changes to meet GMP. But my understanding of Table 8.9 is that it uses baseline GMP as a starting point. And so I'm kind of struggling to see how that might penalise them. And I refer to the evidence of Stuart Ford for WIL, who showed that the baseline GMP leaching rate for dairy farmers was actually higher than their current leaching rate on a scheme-wide basis, which would tend to reinforce that view. So if you're able to comment on that when we hear from you, I'd appreciate that. But Mr. Reid, no questions for you, thank you.
Mr. Solomon?
No, I have no questions either, thank you.
Mr. Reid, how long have you been using the plantain?
4 years, 5 years, ever since they first brought it out as an option.
Yes. And do you feel that it's achieving something?
From the scientific research that I've all read, that I can only rely on, that yes, I do believe that it actually it's uptaking the N that's in the soil.
And are you using it as a mixture?
Yes, it becomes part of our grass sward that we plant when we replant.
And would you expect to do more than you've got at the moment, or do you think you've achieved what you can by including it?
We constantly renew our grasses about every 3 to 4 years because of our cropping program. So
Yes.
we are in constant renewal. So as we renew each paddock, the ecotane goes in as part of the mix. So
Yes.
yeah, so it's constantly renewed because the ecotane will only last, plantain will only last about 4 to 5 years anyway. So we consider that that's a prudent way to retain the best out of it.
Thank you for that. And thank you for all the trouble you've taken in preparing your notes for your address this morning. Thanks indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honour. If we may then proceed to Mr. Hawkins, who I understand has also pre-circulated a PowerPoint presentation to which he wishes to speak.
I'm just going to bring it down. He has.
Your Honour, just by way of clarification, this is the updated PowerPoint that was circulated this morning.
Good afternoon, Your Honour. Good afternoon, Commissioners. My focus...
Good morning, Mr. I'm sorry, there was a momentary interruption to the connection. So we're ready to hear from you now, Mr. Hawkins, and thank you. We do have the presentation in front of us.
Thank you. My focus is going to be on another example of the challenge of using absolute overseer numbers. Now, this has come to us in the last week or 10 days, and we've been busy scurrying around to get to the bottom of it and consider the implications on the Plan Change 7. So there is a bit more detail in here, in the tables and stuff, and that's in part so that others may have a look at it. And I think when I'm going through this, some of my comments are going to be clearly fact. There's going to be some informed guesses, and there will be some questions I will raise for me to follow up on, or I intend to follow up on, or others to follow up on. So I'll try and distinguish between them. The key points are that the key points I'm going to be talking to are the effect of the estimate update on the modelled in-load. Associated with that is the definitions of dairy and dairy support. And a quick summary of that is that the SMAP soils were updated on the 1st of September 2020, and the effect of that is very easy to see and nicely presented in Overseer FM. When I look at 5 of my clients in the WRRP district that are on the light and very light soils, there's a 22% reduction, and it's a fairly coarse arithmetic average, in N loss to water simply from updating the soils. Dairy makes up about 50% of the gross N load in the WRRP subzone, and approximately 60% of that dairy is on very light soils. This gets a little bit speculative. I was not involved in the MGM files early, and this is our best understanding from reports, and I have discussed with quite a number of experts in the last week. So the MGM files, which is Matrix of Good Management files, were originally created for Plan Change 1, Selwyn Te Waihora. Climate and soil, it was an attempt made to simplify stuff, both in climate and soils, and when they did the soils were grouped by profile available water of the dominant sibling in the soil unit. And then the best representative soil was then selected to represent that category. For the very light, which is what VL stands for, group, Require 13A.1 was selected. Now, this is from Lilburn and Webb 2015, and the highlighted yellow one is the very light. And so one thing to note in this is that profile available water in Landcare talks about profile available water to 1 metre. Overseer tends to talks about it to 60 centimetres. So you've got to be careful about how you're looking at the numbers. And so this is directly from the report, and it shows that the Require 13A was the selected soil. What would you call it? If we're dairy farmers, we'd call it calf muck yellow, but it's actually the yellowy orange area. So the large chunk down towards the WRRP is VL, and then there's a smaller area of VL and L, so very light and light, which is up in the headwaters of the head of the Cuss stream, so Zone E. Now, this is a bit of a messy thing. It's a little bit horrible, actually. So what we've got there, the upper part of the table deals with the PAW 60 centimetres from SMAP, Landcare Research, and the lower part is from Overseer. Now, I talked to Alistair Metherell about it, and I don't fully understand it, but apparently Overseer takes the soil and splits it into 3 layers and then recalculates a different and new profile available water. So they're similar but not identical to the SMAP ones. So that's the first point. The second point is that if you go back to 2019, the Require and the Lismore, the Require was 58.6, Lismore was 64.7. So they were regarded as sufficiently similar for the Require 13A to represent the very light soils. Jump to 2020, and those are the updated figures, is 62.7 and 75.6. So what you see is that there's a significantly greater increase in profile available water for the Lismore than there was for the Require. I don't fully understand the reasons for that, but the Require is a recent soil and the Lismore too is a brown soil. So they're quite, with soil structure, so they're quite a different soil. And the numbers are similar for the overseer calculated, so there's an equally large differential. So the two soils have changed quite differently when they were updated. One's changed a lot, one's changed a little. Now these are five farms, and I simply looked at what the impact of N loss to water for the whole farm for recent files, all in the Waimakariri district. Some of them are a mix of light and very light. And I can already see some stuff happening there, like farm D and E. They're at the lower rainfall end of the district, and so the irrigation, the profile of available water and the irrigation's appears to be having a larger effect on those further up. So you can see some stuff starting to come through, but I simply haven't had time to pick it apart. And that's the comment at the bottom. Now, some of the possible changes for the implications at the MGM file level, and this is, I do apologise, this is horrible. There's two sets of changes. I'm fairly confident, but not completely certain, that the MGM VL file was Rekai 13A. So back then, it was reasonably similar when they were set up. If the MGM file for very light is Rekai, then and you stuck with that, and the MGM files and the modelling stuck with the Rekai 13A, there'll probably be a modest, possibly quite small increase in N loss to water when the soils are updated for it. If they used the Lismore, there's likely to be a significant reduction in N loss to water if the MGM files are updated. And then if you jump from what probably happened, which was probably is used as a Rekai 13A, and you jump to a Lismore 2A, you get a significant increase in N loss to water. And one of my counterparts, they jumped on and they had a look at one of their files, and they did that comparison from Rekai 13A to Lismore 2A, and they ended up with a 27% reduction in N loss to water. It all gets a bit tricky because you can't actually go back in time. And because Rekai 13A is such an obscure soil, I've got none of my files where I've ever used it on, because normally what you do, you go back, what I've been doing is going back and then finding a file and then cleaning everything off and then rebuilding the file, and that way you preserve the original SMAP soil detail. So jump in if you want clarification or on. Right, how significant might this change be? Now that is, what's that? That's from the Landcare Research Lilburn 2019, and the blue is dairy. As an aside, I suspect that's the incorrect map included in that report, because that refers to land use in 2015, but that looks more to me like the consented land use, because there should still be gaps in the forestry which are not dairying. That's sort of an aside. So how significant might, have a look how this lines up with the soil maps. Not a perfect match, but you jump backwards and forwards a bit, and a lot of the dairying is sitting on the very light soils. And when you jump to this, which is again that Landcare Research report, we've got about nearly, I'm missing a number there actually. Sorry, and the bold stuff at the top, it's actually 19,186 hectares of 32,000 hectares is dairy land. Nearly 60% of the dairying in the Waimakariri district is on very light soils. And this is where I'll jump in and mention about the dairy land and dairy support definitions. Very early on, there seems to be some mismatch between the definitions and the tables, and there's a particular pie graph which I haven't included, which shows that, talks about dairying being 50% from memory, and dairy support being 5%. Now, can't be realistic, because if I talk to peers, the general feel, and this is about total N loss to water, when I talk to peers, the feeling is that the ratio would be 60-40. So it'd be 60% from the dairy milking platform, 40% from all of the other dairy support. Whereas that particular table, it's got 10% from dairy support and 90% from dairy milking platform, or what they define as dairy. Now, the suspicion is that there's dairy support is either included in dairy or it's included in sheep and beef. Now, the impact of that, so that's all fine, but when you come to writing the rules about reductions, and what we tried to tease apart but couldn't, was the rules on reduction, if they're applying to those, that proportional number, so if you're applying, how's best to describe it? If you want a 15% reduction from dairy, I'm not doing a very good job of this. If you're getting a 15% reduction from dairy, and it includes dairy support and dairy milking platform, the farmer would then split those two out, and the reductions would only be applying to part of that load, and therefore you would not be achieving the reductions that you were hoping to do in your modelling. And I freely admit we tried, but we didn't get to the bottom of that. I'll move on. And that's the summary of the sub-region nitrate losses, and probably just look at the bottom. Total sub-region nitrogen losses, 4,000 tonnes, and dairies, 19, nearly half of that. And so the very light area would account for 1,130 tonnes of the 4,000 tonnes. So it's a significant proportion. And if the MGM files were updated, and what we suspect is the case is correct, then there would be a substantial reduction in that total load. So in summary, the Lismore 2A would be a more appropriate soil for the MGM VL soil. And regardless of which soil is actually currently used in the MGM files, Rakaia or Lismore, the updated soil, if an appropriate soil was used and it was updated, there's going to be a significant reduction in loss to water. Then if that is confirmed, then much of the modelling that follows from that would require updating. And we raise this as just another example of the shortcomings of using overseer for absolute values. And my final point is that the soil on the farm is still the same as the soil that was a year ago. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Hawkins. And while some of the reasoning needs to the thought by people like me who can't capture it all immediately, your conclusion is important for us, and we're grateful to you for that. Any questions for Mr. Hawkins, Commissioner Van Voorthuizen?
Yeah, just trying to understand some of the implications of that, and I'm sure we're going to hear about this in reply, what that means for the modelling and for the Plan Change 7 provisions. But if what you say is true, that just updating the SMAP results in a paper reduction of 22% of N loss, that would make potentially make the GMP baseline figure lower, whereas on-farm practice has stayed the same. So to get even further reductions from a lower GMP baseline is going to be even harder to achieve in real life. Is that a potential implication?
Make sure I answer that,
Yeah.
because that one's still coming. The point about this is that as one all along have felt that modelled does not match measured. And we've questioned whether it's the overseer modelling or the attenuation factors. So it just didn't make sense. This may be part of the explanation for that. And so we've been concerned that the modelling, we believe, overestimates the equilibrium values in the future. So potentially this pulls back those equilibrium values because just the size of the impact is so large. So is that enough of that one?
Maybe, but I was sort of trying to think through what that might mean in terms of the Table 8-9 reductions, which use baseline GMP as a starting point.
Okay.
And you see if the baseline GMP number on paper changes to become 22, say 20% less than what it was before. So their starting point is lower. So to achieve the reductions in real life is even harder.
But
Is that correct?
I'll answer that one. But the only reason for the Table 8.9 table is to achieve
I
reductions
know, I understand that, but
based on modelled future results rather than actual results. So we believe it's overestimated the equilibrium values in the future, and therefore there's a whole cascade of effects from this through stuff, and some of it takes quite a bit to get your head around.
I understand what you're saying, but
Yes.
I was potentially raising an additional concern,
Yes.
which is that the starting point for Table 8-9 might change, making the reductions harder to achieve in real life.
My first guess to that would be it's a relative thing. So that I wouldn't jump to too much concern about that one. What potentially will change the GMP numbers is that our understanding is that Overseer at some point will update the pasture quality. As I understand it, the general feeling is that what's been happening in the past is the pasture quality in Canterbury is much higher in practice than the rest of the country, and yet a uniform or a similar number for ME is used throughout the country. And given that Overseer back calculates pasture production, we end up with very high estimates of dry matter production on Canterbury dairy farms. Now, then you jump to PC5 and the nitrogen good management practice calculation, and that is based on dry matter. So it's specifically based on dry matter, and it's from that that the GMP nitrogen figure is calculated. Am I guessing you can see where that's going? So if the dry matter estimate drops, then the GMP number drops.
All right, no further questions, thank you.
Commissioner Solomon?
No, I have no questions, thank you.
No, that's fine. Yeah. I should ask that, you say? Sorry, Your Honour.
That's quite all right.
Your Honour, I was just
I was
clarifying.
wondering if we're about to add something that we ought to hear. But if you're not, then it's my role to thank you for the care you've taken in your original statement and for adding your presentation today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honour. I was just clarifying that obviously this witness has prepared other evidence which is not supplanted by this. This is supplementary.
No, we
Yes.
take that for granted. We have it before us. We've read it. We see that this is a good opportunity have additional material, and which we have that now.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Mr Hawkins, and thank you, Your Honour, and members of the panel. I'm just wondering if Your Honour wishes to commence with Dr Freeman at this stage and then take a break partway through his evidence, or commence after the lunch adjournment. We still have some time before the lunch adjournment.
What's your preference, Mr Van der Waal?
Well, I think it would be helpful to get through as much of the evidence as possible and commence with Dr Freeman. It's not as if he's going to be under cross-examination during lunch and adjournment, so we can still talk to him.
No, we're not going to have any cross-examination.
I may have raised that point previously, so thank you. If I can then call Dr Freeman, who again
Thank you very much.
has provided you with a PowerPoint presentation, and obviously his evidence is taken as read.
Yes, well, it is. But Dr Freeman also provided us with a summary of evidence, and I'm not wanting you to think that we're overlooking that summary, but that's part of the PowerPoint, is it?
Good afternoon. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Yes, Your Honour and Commissioners, I'm entirely in your hands. I have got a summary of the evidence that's been pre-circulated. I'm happy to take you through it, but I'm also very happy to take it as read. I'm entirely in your hands.
Well, I think we should give you the opportunity to make some remarks before we come to questions, and how you do that, I think, is just how you feel, really. But the summary is yes, perhaps you don't need to read it all to us, but you should at least present the conclusions.
Sorry, is it F5
At
or
page
Control F5?
13, is it?
Oh, okay. Okay, thank you very much. Then perhaps it would be useful if we could quickly go through the summary, if I can run this through. I just wanted the opportunity, because I'm very conscious that my evidence is quite long. I just thought it would be useful to go through what I think are some of the key points that I've identified in my evidence. And then obviously if you have some specific questions, we can come back to specifics. But briefly, there's clearly been some oversimplification of water quality information, and potentially in the transfer of information from technical experts to people who then need to summarize it and simplify it and take it in as part of the plan process. And I think I've clearly identified a number of instances where there's been some oversimplification of both water quality, state and trend. I have tried, I suppose, in my assessment to have a sort of a high-level technical and a high-level plan structure perspective. And one of the things that I found confusing, if you like, wearing both a science and planning hat, was there is confusing and, in my opinion, inappropriate use of words such as targets, limits, outcomes, words that appear in places to have two meanings. And when words like limit has two meanings, I get confused. You've heard already a number of concerns about some inappropriate modelling constraints, assumptions, and modelling methodology. But I'd also underline that even though that there are a number of significant concerns about the modelling, I would acknowledge that it is a highly demanding and challenging task. And clearly the team that's been charged with doing that work has essentially gone forward with some, in my view, inappropriate constraints put on them by, apparently by the zone committee. So they've been essentially given a brief to go and do some modelling, but no, you can't include this area and you can't include that area, which from a technical basis, when I've been going through the material, I was just not able to understand why certain areas were not included, because technically, clearly, full catchment areas should be included, but there seems to have been a brief to exclude certain areas. And I suppose one of the key fundamentals is that even when some of the modelling constraints and inappropriate assumptions can be resolved, and I think they can be. I don't consider that the whole modelling process is completely broken. I think it can be fixed. But in my view, even if it is fixed, one still has to think of it as a highly complex model with inherent uncertainties, and always keep those very high levels of uncertainties in mind when then trying to translate that science information into a robust plan framework. So quickly, some of the comments about water quality, state and trend. There are some very broad sweeping statements made in the Section 32 report that, in my view, don't accurately summarize the details in the original science reports. And I've given some examples of that. I really think that the Section 32 report should have given itself more space to paint a more accurate picture of the state of the environment, rather than I almost get the impression that the authors have been told they can only write X sentences, whereas my scientific brain is saying there must be a however here to more properly describe, for example, that the comments about increases in nitrate, nitrogen concentrations in groundwater, certainly the Silver Stream area indicates that there have been very significant increases in nitrate, nitrogen in shallow groundwater and springs. But that's not the case in other parts of the zone. And there clearly has been some inappropriate assumptions made by occasionally just looking at relatively short terms. For example, this graph. I think with the best of intentions, this bore in particular was singled out at one stage as indicating that nitrate, nitrogen concentrations in groundwater were increasing. And they were. For the 10-year period that this study looked at, between 2006 and 2016, the nitrate, nitrogen concentrations in that bore were increasing, and a statistically valid conclusion was made, and I checked and came up with exactly the same number when I looked at the exact same period. But when you stand back and realize that monitoring's been done of that bore since the mid-80s, then if you look at the long-term trend, you get a different picture. And so occasionally I just see examples like this where an inappropriate conclusion has been made because the bigger picture hasn't been looked at. The technical reports, particularly in relation to surface water, do, in my view, accurately identify a range of contaminants that are having adverse effects, and a number of them particularly focus on runoff contaminants such as sediment, for example, and the clear adverse effects that are occurring there. But again, the Section 32 report in particular seems to generalized too much. And suddenly, instead of recognition of a number of contaminants having adverse effects in the catchment, the plan change seems to just almost ignore all these other contaminants and hone in on nitrate, and there's almost an implicit assumption that all the problems are being caused by nitrate, whereas clearly they're not. Now, there may be other provisions eventually that come in that will be looking, focusing more particularly on surface contaminants, but my concern, I suppose, was almost the sort of intermingling of cause and effect. The word limit, and I may be a lone voice in the wilderness here, but the word limit is used in PC7 to indicate both a mass load, i.e. Kilograms or tons mass per unit time, but at the same time the word limit appears to be referring to a concentration of something. Now, at one level, that doesn't matter too much, but then when you start to get into the details of tables and rules and details, it may be quite significant. Are we talking about a mass load of something, kilograms of N per hectare per year, or are we talking about the concentration of nitrate nitrogen in grams per cubic meter, for example? I think the NPS, freshwater management terminology and definitions are significantly less ambiguous. I think there would be significant benefit, regardless of what happens with the plan, if the terminology could be better aligned with that in the NPS freshwater management. So instead of using the word limit in a very broad sense, target water quality attribute states, while I acknowledge it's quite a mouthful, it is well defined in the NPS, and I think it would be prudent for regional plans to use the same terminology. There are a mix of statistical descriptions used for water quality, and I couldn't find any explanations why, for example, if I get it the right way round, I think it's surface water quality that seems to be defined in terms of averages, and groundwater quality defined in terms of medians and 95 percentiles. There's no explanation clearly given as to why average is used for one and median for the other. It's generally accepted these days in water quality science that medians and percentiles are a better way to better signal what the quality of the resource is. They are better in that they disregard significant outliers that might otherwise give you a confusing signal. That's why, in the same way, the real estate sector has finally started referring to median house prices. They don't generally refer to average house prices, because when we think about houses, it's relatively easy for us to understand that an average house price might be affected by somebody's $6 million mansion, whereas a median house price is going to be more representative of what we are intuitively thinking about as an average. But an average gets affected by the billion-dollar house. The medians don't. So a median is a better statistic to describe water quality generally. I also had great difficulty, and I must admit this is at again, a relatively high level without necessarily getting into the details of Commissioner Van Voorthuysen's query about Table 8.9 and the rules, but I was looking for a thread, a continuity from high-level objectives and policies down to these detailed water quality target attributes. and I could not find one. I could not find a clear policy framework that took me by the hand from the very high level RMA, RPS, and national policy statement type wording. I couldn't find intermediate policies that made it clear that, for example, say half MAV was what the plan was interpreting the higher level documents. I was looking for clear policy statements that I could follow through down to the numbers in some of the tables, 8, 5, 6, 7, for example. When we're talking about, say, units of 1 or 3.8, for example, I was looking for that line. Now, it may be that's partly because of my unfamiliarity of all the documents, but I couldn't find it. I was also concerned, although it may not be as significant now with the new NPS, but the original NPS was not clearly described by the zone committee. Some gremlins appeared to have come in somewhere such that the specific terminology in the 2017 NPS was not what the zone committee published as their understanding for the rationale of nitrate standards, for want of a better term. And I've got some tables in the evidence that you could look at the subtle but important differences in wording from the MPS to the comments of the zone committee. I also couldn't, as you just heard from Mr. Hawkins, I did dive into a little bit of the detail of the table and some of the rules, and because the table, for example, refers to dairy and all other, well, then the first thing I would do is go and look in the definitions and find out exactly what dairy is defined as and what all other is defined as, and I couldn't find it. So at one level, a part of me would want to spend more time checking and going through the details of how the various rules link up with the table. But the minute I get there, when I first look for things like definitions, I couldn't find them. And as far as I've mentioned this to a number of people, and nobody so far has been able to identify where those definitions are. Someone might yet be able to. Whoops, sorry. Just on the modelling, now you've heard briefly on this. I'd just really like to emphasise that clearly the MPAs have excluded an area of so-called heavy soils, but there's been no publication that I'm aware of that has clarified exactly where these heavy soils are. I've not been able to align them from soil maps. It is not clear exactly where they are. I understand, and it's been reported, the logic, as I understand it, was that perhaps the zone committee felt that in areas of heavy soil, other policies were going to be more important to manage runoff contaminants rather than leaching contaminants. But it appears that they seem to have assumed that there would be no leaching from areas of, quote, heavy soils, but clearly there is. And then at a wider sense, receptor catchments like the Cust River, approximately half the catchment of just the Cust River isn't included in the MPAs. And I couldn't find an explanation as to why some of these surface water catchments had been excluded. And clearly, if parts of a catchment are not excluded and modelled nutrient reductions are then applied to a limited part of a catchment, then obviously what's left will have to have much more significant reductions than would otherwise occur if the full catchment was included. The other key sort of technical concern I've got with the modelling is that there are loads to come identified. And I think that is probably an accurate conclusion for certainly parts of the Silver Stream catchment. It's undoubted that there will be loads to come there. But clearly, the surface water quality data and the groundwater quality data strongly suggest that, for example, in the Ohoka Stream, there is no more load to come. The dairying boom, say, from the early 90s to, say, 2014, 15, there's no link of that with concentrations in, say, the Ohoka Stream. So there clearly doesn't seem to be a contaminant load to come. Well, not in terms of a sweeping generalization for the whole zone. Other issues about the modelling that have been touched on. There has been peer input to the modelling, but there hasn't been, as far as I've been able and others have been able to establish, there hasn't been a clear independent peer review taken of the modelling. Now, that may have been a resource limitation. It may have been a consequence of a number of experts being involved early, providing some input into the modelling early in the process, and therefore they're not really in a position, if they've been a contributor, to then stand back and do a critical peer review. But notwithstanding that, this type of process has to have an independent peer review of material if people are going to have confidence in the results. It's also a fundamental part of this type of environmental monitoring that you really need to very carefully have some independent data to evaluate or validate a model. So there's obviously been a lot of calibration work done of the model, so using information and adjusting the model until things better line up. And that's obviously a critical part of it, and the modelers are quite clear about how that produces, in some instances, good matches, in other areas not so good. But the key with this sort of work is then to say, right, well, we've done as best we can with calibrating the model. Right, now let's put some completely new data in and see how the model performs. That, as far as I'm aware, has not been done. And that is a critical test. It's one thing to adjust a model and say, hey, we've got it looking pretty good, end of story. You really need to test a model with some new data and see how it performs with that. And that data then has to be data that wasn't used in the calibration.
Well, Dr. Freeman, I think we've done very well with your summary as far as it's gone up to now. And I think we should take the lunch break now and ask you to complete your summary presentation after that. So we'll start again at 2 o'clock.